The drums never stopped. For 80 days, the war drum of the Templo Mayor beat across Lake Texcoco, audible from miles away, carrying through smoke and heat and the smell of a city dying. And the men on the causeways could do nothing but listen. Spanish accounts record soldiers watching their captured comrades marched up the pyramid steps in full view of the siege lines. Hearts cut from their chests at the altar of Huitzilopochtli. The drum never pausing, the Aztec defenders jeering from the walls. The besieging force numbered approximately 900 Spanish soldiers. The city they were besieging held an estimated 200,000 people. And this city had already driven them out once in a single night, killing nearly half their number on the way. So what did Hernan Cortez do? He dismantled 13 ships, carried them over a mountain range in pieces, and used them to strangle a civilization. But here is the question that colonial chronicles hint at and never fully answer. Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor, approximately 25 years old, commanding the finest warrior culture in the Americas, had a moment on June 29th of 1521, when the Spanish were driven back beyond the city gates, when the siege that had ground on for weeks suddenly cracked open. Aztec accounts describe the Spanish Tlaxcalan forces suffering a devastating defeat on the causeway. The path to destroying Cortez's army, his coalition, and his campaign was briefly, genuinely open. Indigenous sources suggest he did not pursue. Why a man who had prepared his entire life for exactly this crisis, who had chosen total war when every other option failed, who personally led sorties wielding his obsidian-bladed club through the ruins of his own city? Why he made the choice he apparently made in that moment is something the chronicles hint at but never fully resolve. You will discover three things in this account that most histories of the conquest obscure. First, the decisive weapon at Tenochtitlan was not Spanish steel or Spanish gunpowder. It was 13 shallow-hulled riverboats, hand-carried over a mountain range by thousands of Tlaxcalan porters, then reassembled on a lake the Spanish had never sailed before. Second, the person Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of the conquest's most important eyewitness chroniclers, most credited with making the entire victory possible, was not a Spanish soldier at all, but an enslaved woman named Malintzin, whom the Mexica came to call Cortez himself by her name. Third, the Tlaxcalan warriors who provided the overwhelming majority of the fighting force and who died in their tens of thousands received formal recognition as conquistadors, with tax exemptions and privileges that the colonial bureaucracy quietly erased within 2 generations. To understand why Cuauhtémoc made the decisions he made, and why the man who defeated him would die, suspected of treason by the king he had served for 30 years, we need to go back to 1519, and the moment a group of Spanish soldiers walked out onto a causeway above a lake and stopped moving entirely. In November of 1519, Spanish soldiers who had never seen a city larger than Seville walked out onto a stone causeway above Lake Texcoco and by multiple accounts stopped moving. Some wondered aloud whether they were dreaming. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was there and who would spend the rest of his long life trying to find adequate words for what he saw, compared the city before him to the enchantments in the tale of Amadis. Hernan Cortez, writing to King Charles V in one of his famous letters to the Spanish crown, described Tenochtitlan as comparable in size to Seville or Cordoba. These were not figures of speech designed to flatter a distant monarch. They were the only comparisons available to men confronting something genuinely without European precedent. Scholars estimate Tenochtitlan's population at between 200,000 and 300,000 inhabitants at the time of Spanish contact, numbers that would have placed it among the largest cities on Earth, rivaled in the Western world perhaps only by Paris, Venice, and Constantinople. Wikipedia's account of the city, drawing on the academic work of researchers including Edward Kalnick, Ross Hassig, and Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, gives the most commonly accepted figure of approximately 212,500 people on 13.5 square kilometers of island. It was 5 times the size of the London of Henry VIII. Its great market of Tlatelolco, according to both Cortez's letters and Britannica's account of pre-Columbian civilizations, accommodated 60,000 buyers and sellers on main market days. Its central temple complex featured a double pyramid, 100 feet high and 300 feet at its base, dedicated to the gods Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. Moctezuma's palace alone was said to contain 300 rooms grouped around 3 interior courts, covering approximately 10 acres. The city sat on an artificial island in the western portion of Lake Texcoco, a shallow, brackish body of water in the Valley of Mexico. 3 stone causeways connected it to the mainland: the Tepeyac to the north, the Tlacopan to the west, and the Iztapalapa to the south. 2 double aqueducts brought fresh water from the springs of Chapultepec, 12 kilometers away. A 16-kilometer dike built by Netzahualcoyotl separated the saline eastern waters from the fresh water near the city. The interior was a grid of streets and canals, navigable by canoe, allowing the movement of tribute, food, and people with extraordinary efficiency. This engineering marvel was the capital of the Triple Alliance, the political entity that historians and popular usage call the Aztec Empire. Comprising Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. As Ross Hassig's scholarship on Mexico in the Spanish conquest documents, the Triple Alliance maintained dominance across central Mexico, not through integration, but through tribute and the threat of military force. Subject peoples paid in food, textiles, labor, and, most painfully, in the human captives demanded for religious sacrifice. The Flower Wars, ritualized battles conducted specifically to take prisoners for the Templo Mayor's altars, created endemic trauma across the region. Subject city-states contributed warriors and resources to an empire that gave them little in return except continued existence. This is the historical context that Matthew Restall's 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, now a standard text in conquest scholarship, places at the center of its argument. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not primarily a Spanish military achievement. It was the culmination of a massive indigenous uprising against Mexica dominance, in which Spanish soldiers served as the technological vanguard of a much larger coalition of peoples who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Anthropologist Eric Wolf put it directly: Spanish firepower and cavalry would have been impotent against the Mexican armies without the support of the Tlaxcalans and Texcocans. The Spanish arrived with approximately 500 soldiers and 100 sailors. They would besiege Tenochtitlan with a coalition that grew to an estimated 80,000 to 150,000 indigenous warriors. Understanding this imbalance between the story most people know and what the historical record actually shows is the first thing this script needs to establish. The city that Cortez's men saw from the causeway in November of 1519 was magnificent, internally divided, and sitting on a political fault line that was already cracking. What was missing was someone willing to step into that fault and pull. Every word Hernan Cortez wrote about himself was written for a king he was trying to impress and a governor he was trying to outmaneuver. That is the essential problem with Cortez as a historical subject. The most detailed account of his motivations comes from legal documents he designed to justify actions that were, by the standards of his own government, illegal. His letters to King Charles V, the genre historians call probanzas, or proofs of merit, were published in Spain almost immediately and widely circulated across Europe. They remain indispensable primary sources. They are also, without exception, self-serving arguments dressed as reports. Born around 1485 in Medellin, in the Extremadura region of Spain, Cortez came from a family his secretary Francisco López de Gómara described as having little wealth but much honor. His parents sent him at 14 to study law at the University of Salamanca. He abandoned his studies after approximately 2 years. Gómara, in his biography of Cortez, itself a deeply partisan document, since Gómara never visited Mexico and wrote at Cortez's direction, describes the young man as ruthless, haughty, mischievous, and quarrelsome, much given to women, and thoroughly unsuited to provincial legal practice. In 1504, at approximately 19 years old, Cortez sailed for Hispaniola. He spent 6 years in the Caribbean, farming, serving as a notary, making the connections that would advance his ambitions before joining Diego Velázquez's expedition to Cuba in 1511. When Velázquez became governor, Cortez became alcalde of the town of Santiago and, over the following years, one of the governor's trusted subordinates. The relationship deteriorated as Cortez's ambitions grew. In 1518, Velázquez commissioned him to lead an expedition to the Mexican mainland, then rescinded the order when he began to suspect, correctly, that Cortez had larger plans than colonial exploration. Cortez sailed anyway, in February of 1519, before the formal revocation could reach him. This act, sailing without orders, in defiance of the highest Spanish authority in the Americas, defined everything that followed. Cortez solved his legal problem with characteristic ingenuity. He founded the settlement of Veracruz specifically to have his own men elect him captain general, making him answerable directly to King Charles V, rather than to Governor Velázquez. He then, according to most accounts, ordered most of his ships destroyed to eliminate retreat as an option for his men and retreat as a possibility in his own planning. Some sources say burned. Modern historians generally prefer scuttled or disabled. The dramatic core is the same in either reading. The commander of this expedition ensured that the only direction available was forward. Cortez was 34 years old when he sailed from Cuba. He was 36 when Tenochtitlan fell. In between, he executed the most consequential act of diplomacy in the history of the Americas, building and maintaining a coalition of tens of thousands of warriors from competing indigenous nations, each with different grievances against Tenochtitlan and different levels of trust in the Spanish. The anthropologist Eric Wolf's judgment that indigenous allies were the decisive factor in the conquest is the modern scholarly consensus. What made Cortez indispensable to that coalition was not military genius. It was political intelligence of a very high order. The irony that would define his biography arrived immediately after his greatest success. Charles V named him Captain General and eventually granted him the title Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca, along with vast estates and encomienda rights over approximately 23,000 indigenous people. But the king sent royal officials to govern New Spain in his place. Cortez spent the years after 1521 in escalating legal battles, exploratory expeditions to Baja California, and repeated voyages to Spain to plead his case. He died on December 2nd, 1547, near Seville, of pleurisy. Wealthy by most measures, embittered by his own assessment, his remains moved more than 8 times in the centuries since. His bones have never rested easily. His letters to Charles V barely mention smallpox. This omission, as will become clear, says more about the nature of those letters than about the course of the conquest. His name meant descending eagle, from the Nahuatl Cuautli for eagle and Temoc for descent, evoking a raptor diving toward prey. He was the 11th and last Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, the final Aztec emperor by any reasonable definition of the term. He took power at approximately 25 years old, in late 1520, under conditions that would have broken a lesser leader before the first battle. What he built from those conditions, and what he failed to achieve despite everything, is the human center of this story. Cuauhtemoc was the eldest legitimate son of Emperor Ahuitzotl, and, according to Wikipedia's detailed account of his biography, was almost certainly educated in the Calmecac, the elite school for noble Aztec boys that combined religious instruction with military training and the cultivation of the rhetorical skills expected of rulers. To have been named ruler of Tlatelolco in 1515, with the title Cuauhtlatoani, he would have needed to demonstrate both noble lineage and proven warrior skill, specifically the capture of enemies in battle for religious sacrifice. He had done both. He married the Aztec princess, who would later be known as Isabel Moctezuma, a daughter of Moctezuma II. He was, by every measure his culture could apply, prepared for exactly this crisis. The crisis arrived in layers. In 1520, the Spanish were expelled from Tenochtitlan. During the catastrophe, the Spanish themselves would call La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. The Emperor Cuitlahuac, who had organized that expulsion and who Bernal Diaz remembered as the Lord who ejected us from Mexico, reigned for exactly 80 days before dying of smallpox. This is confirmed across multiple sources. The annals of Tenochtitlan record his death from the pustules at the end of the month of Cacholi, late November or early December of 1520. Peter Martyr's account, Bernal Diaz's memoir, and Lopez de Gomara's biography of Cortez all confirm the cause. The emperor who defeated the Spanish died of a European disease he had never encountered before the Europeans arrived. The noble council elected Cuauhtemoc to succeed him. His coronation, scholars note, was subdued. The city was still in shock. The epidemic was not yet over, and the Spanish were already rebuilding in Tlaxcala. He inherited a capital that had lost its emperor, a significant portion of its military leadership, and an unknown but devastating fraction of its population, all within the space of 60 days. He also inherited a strategic situation in which former subject city-states were pledging loyalty to Cortez at a rate that the Mexica could not match diplomatically. His response was total war, pursued with a clarity that the EBSCO Research Starter's account of his biography describes as the defining characteristic of his leadership. Unlike Moctezuma, who had attempted to manage the Spanish through diplomacy and accommodation, Cuauhtemoc had no illusions about Spanish intentions. He reorganized the Aztec military toward urban guerrilla tactics, fighting in the streets and canals that the Aztecs knew far better than any invader could learn. He decreed that any Aztec discovered converting to Christianity would be sacrificed. He executed deserters to maintain military discipline during the siege, documented in multiple accounts of the siege's final phase. He led sorties personally, wielding an obsidian-bladed macuahuitl throughout the 80 days of the formal siege. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who had every reason to diminish the men he defeated, described Cuauhtemoc as elegant in his person. Cortez himself praised his valor in letters to King Charles V. Even the Spanish accounts, written by the victors, filtered through the priorities of conquest, could not entirely suppress what they were looking at. A young man defending a civilization against impossible odds. with perfect lucidity about what defeat would mean, until the day he stepped into a canoe and tried to cross a lake that was no longer his. The Florentine Codex does not soften what it describes. Compiled by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, in collaboration with Nahua elders and authors between 1545 and 1590. Book 12 of this extraordinary 12-volume work preserves what survivors remembered of the epidemic that swept Tenochtitlan in late 1520. The indigenous account reads, "Sores erupted on our faces, our breasts, our bellies. We were covered with agonizing sores from head to foot." The Dumbarton Oaks Research Collection, drawing on this passage, adds what followed. Many died from the plague, but many died of hunger. There were deaths from starvation, for they had no one left to care for them. The disease the Nahua called Hue Zahuatl, the Great Rash, was smallpox. It entered Mexico with the Narvaez expedition. The force Governor Velázquez sent to arrest Cortez in the spring of 1520. Spanish sources attribute patient zero to an enslaved African named Francisco de Aguilla, who remained in Chempoala when he fell ill, though historians note this identification comes from sources with obvious interests and cannot be independently verified. What can be verified is the epidemic's trajectory, spreading from the Gulf Coast inward from May through September of 1520, reaching Tenochtitlan by October or November, burning through the city for approximately 60 days, and ending in Tenochtitlan specifically by early December. The consequences for Aztec military and political capacity were catastrophic in ways that extend beyond simple mortality. Emperor Cuitlahuac was among the dead. So were senior warriors, local governors, tax collectors, and engineers. The organizational infrastructure of an empire. The history skills account of the epidemic documents that senior warriors, local governors, tax collectors, and engineers died in such numbers that effective government became impossible. The tribute system collapsed. Provinces could not send food, labor, or warriors to a capital in chaos. Markets closed. The traditional rotation of garrison warriors was shattered. When Cortez and his rebuilt army re-entered the territory around Texcoco in January of 1521, Bernal Diaz noted in his memoir that the Spanish encountered no meaningful resistance in areas that should have been defended, because the warriors there were still too weak from smallpox to fight. Scholarly estimates of mortality vary significantly and honestly. The Dumbarton Oaks exhibit on the epidemic, drawing on academic sources, suggests a population loss of between 5 and 8 million people across Mesoamerica during the 1520 outbreak. The EBSCO Research Starters account gives mortality in Tenochtitlan itself as between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. A PBS NewsHour analysis of the epidemic's historical role suggests the city's population was reduced by approximately 40% in a single year. These figures are estimates rather than census data, and historians are appropriately cautious about precision. What is not in dispute is the scale. The disease also produced a psychological consequence that no military campaign could have manufactured. The Spanish, having grown up in Europe where smallpox was endemic, had largely acquired immunity through childhood exposure. They appeared, to Aztec observers, to be immune to a plague that was killing one in 3 of the people around them. Indigenous accounts suggest this was interpreted by some in some communities as evidence that the gods had abandoned the Mexica or had sided with the invaders. This is reported in secondary sources as an indigenous interpretation. Whether it was widespread or decisive is genuinely debated among historians. The debate about smallpox's relative weight in the conquest has not been resolved. Alfred Crosby, whose Columbian exchange established the field of ecological history, argued that disease did more to defeat the Aztecs than any military action. Jared Diamond, in Guns, Germs, and Steel, placed epidemic disease at the center of European colonial success across the Americas. Matthew Restall, in 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, offers a necessary corrective. Overdetermining the role of disease erases the agency of the indigenous coalition, reduces the Tlaxcalans and Texcocans to passive bystanders in their own political decisions, and ultimately produces a history that is as distorted as the triumphalist Spanish version. The conquest required disease, coalition, technology, and an accumulation of Aztec political failures. Remove any one factor and the story changes. What is certain is this: when Cortez returned to begin the final campaign in December of 1520, he was not attacking the same city he had left 6 months earlier. He was attacking a city in mourning, under new leadership, with its military and administrative capacity severely compromised. The brilliant defensive strategy that Cuauhtémoc would pursue over the following 80 days, and the extraordinary resistance that his people would mount despite everything, makes far more sense when understood against this context. They were fighting with what remained after the Invisible Army had already done its worst. The history books tend to describe the conquest of Tenochtitlan as a Spanish achievement. The numbers make this description difficult to sustain. At the height of the siege in 1521, Cortez commanded approximately 900 Spanish soldiers. He commanded an indigenous coalition that various sources estimate at between 80,000 and 150,000 warriors, not counting the porters, engineers, and logistical workers who kept the campaign supplied. The Spanish soldiers were the technological vanguard. The indigenous coalition was the army. Understanding why that coalition existed and what it was actually fighting for is essential to understanding what the fall of Tenochtitlan meant. The Tlaxcaltecs are the place to begin. Tlaxcala was a sovereign state that had maintained independence from the Triple Alliance through decades of what the provided research document, drawing on scholarly sources, describes as military resistance and political isolation. The Aztecs had encircled Tlaxcala effectively, blocking the state's access to salt, cotton, and other lowland goods. The Flower Wars, the ritualized warfare the Aztecs conducted specifically to take captives for sacrifice, had bled Tlaxcala continuously without producing a decisive result, since Tlaxcala consistently resisted absorption into the empire. The Tlaxcalans were not neutral observers of Aztec power. They were its intended victims who had survived long enough to see an alternative arrive. After initially fighting the Spanish in September of 1519, 3 battles in 3 days in which the Spanish barely survived, the Tlaxcalan Council, led by Xicotencatl the Elder, made the calculation that Wikipedia's account of the Spanish conquest describes as decisive for the entire campaign's outcome. Allying with the newcomers provided the only viable path to destroying their hereditary enemies. This was not collaboration with colonizers in any simple sense. It was a rational political decision by people who had been fighting for their survival against Aztec dominance for generations. The Tlaxcalans became, in the words of the indigenous advocacy research organization Indigenous Mexico, the bulk of the infantry, and the providers of the canoes that covered the advance of the brigantines across the lagoon of Tenochtitlan. Xicotencatl the Elder provided over 10,000 warriors under the command of Chichimecatecuhtli. The force would grow substantially through the campaign. The defection of Texcoco was the structural blow that broke the Triple Alliance from within. Texcoco was one of the 3 founding members of the alliance. Its support for Cortez transformed the conflict from a foreign invasion into something that looked, from inside the Aztec world, like a civil war. Ixtlilxochitl II, installed by Cortez to replace the pro-Aztec leadership, provided both warriors and the massive labor force required for the brigantine construction project. Texcoco's eastern lakeshore position became the staging ground for the entire final campaign. The person who made the coalition possible to build and maintain was neither a Spanish officer nor a Tlaxcalan elder. Malintzin, known to Spanish sources as La Malinche or Doña Marina, and to posterity as one of the most consequential individuals in the history of the Americas, was born into a Nahuatl-speaking noble family, sold into Maya-speaking territory as a child, and given to Cortez as one of 20 enslaved women after the Battle of Cintla in March of 1519. She spoke both Nahuatl and the local Maya dialect. A Spanish soldier named Jerónimo de Aguilar spoke that Maya dialect and Spanish. Together, they formed a translation chain that allowed Cortez to negotiate with the entire Nahuatl-speaking world he was entering. She uncovered the Cholula ambush plot, documented in Cortez's own letters to the king. She stood on captured palace rooftops during the final siege, calling out to Mexican nobles to surrender, as recorded in the Florentine Codex. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, having witnessed everything, credited her, in his memoir, with the victory. The Mexica themselves came to call Cortez Malinche. She was so central to his operation that his name became hers. The coalition's fighting force lost approximately 30,000 Tlaxcalan warriors over the course of the entire campaign, according to Warfare History Network's account of the siege. They received in return formal recognition as conquistadors, exemption from certain taxes, the right to carry Spanish weapons and ride horses. These privileges survived approximately 2 generations before the colonial bureaucracy quietly erased them. By the 1580s, Tlaxcalan nobles were sending formal embassies to Spain to plead for the restoration of promises Cortez had made in 1520. The plea went unheeded. The coalition that took Tenochtitlan, was built on grievances that were real, decisions that were rational, and promises that would not be kept. Tenochtitlan was, above all else, an island. Everything the Aztecs had built, the hydraulic engineering, the causeways, the canals, the market system, flowed from this central geographic fact. The same geography that made the city magnificent made it, in theory, impregnable. The causeways were 3 narrow lines connecting it to the mainland, each one a perfect killing ground for any attacking force that tried to advance along it. The lake surrounding the city was controlled by thousands of Aztec war canoes that could move warriors, supplies, and reinforcements with speed that any land-based force could not match. During the original occupation in 1519 and 20, the Aztec canoe fleet had demonstrated exactly what this meant in practice. Spanish soldiers on the causeways could be attacked from the water on both sides simultaneously, with no way to respond. Cortez understood, after La Noche Triste, that Tenochtitlan could not be taken without controlling the lake, and he understood that controlling the lake required vessels that the Aztec canoe fleet could not outmaneuver. There were no such vessels within 100 kilometers of Lake Texcoco. The solution he devised, and that the Spanish shipwright Martin Lopez executed, was one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history. Build 13 shallow-hulled brigantines in Tlaxcala, disassemble them into transportable components, carry those components over the Sierra Nevada mountains, and reassemble the ships on the shores of Lake Texcoco. Each brigantine was approximately 12 meters long, roughly 40 feet, designed with a shallow draft, suitable for lake navigation, and capable of being propelled by both sail and oars. Each was mounted with a cannon. Hall of Ancient Warriors' account of the siege describes them as floating batteries that could clear the causeways and intercept the food and water supplies arriving via the lake. Lopez supervised their construction at Tlaxcala, while Cortez spent the autumn of 1520 consolidating control of the territory surrounding the lake. Thousands of Tlaxcalan porters, some accounts give figures as high as 8,000, though this specific number appears in secondary rather than named primary sources and should be understood as an approximation, carried the disassembled components over the mountains in pieces. A canal was excavated from Texcoco to the lake's edge, requiring its own substantial indigenous labor force to allow the reassembled ships to be launched. The brigantines were launched on April the 28th, 1521. Cortez commanded one of the vessels personally. Their first engagement demonstrated immediately what they represented. Using a favorable wind that came up unexpectedly, the brigantine fleet attacked the Aztec canoe fleet assembled to meet them, and, in Hall of Ancient Warriors description, mowed down the canoes with cannon fire and ramming tactics that the war canoes had no answer for. Within weeks, Cortez's forces controlled Lake Texcoco, the supply lines that had been keeping Tenochtitlan fed and watered, the canoes bringing maize from the mainland, the fresh water from beyond the besiegers' reach, were cut or threatened. The Aztec response to the brigantines was creative and documented. Cuauhtémoc had wooden stakes driven into the lake bottom and deep pits dug in the shallows to damage or ground the Spanish vessels. This is confirmed in multiple accounts of the siege, including the New World Encyclopedia's summary and Hall of Ancient Warriors' more detailed treatment. The countermeasures slowed but did not stop the brigantines. The Spanish learned to probe ahead of their ships and adapted their routes. The fundamental tactical problem remained. A 12-meter vessel with a cannon and crossbowmen aboard could not be stopped by a war canoe carrying warriors armed with obsidian-bladed clubs, however skilled those warriors were. What Lopez built, and what the Tlaxcalan porters carried over a mountain range that the Spanish had crossed for the first time less than 2 years earlier, was not simply a naval advantage. It was the transformation of Tenochtitlan's defining geographic strength, its position on a lake, into a strategic liability. The city that had never needed to defend itself from the water was now trapped by the water it had always relied on. On May the 26th, 1521, Alvarado and Oled's divisions rode to Chapultepec on the lake's western edge and destroyed the aqueduct. The formal siege had begun. What it meant, practically, to destroy the Chapultepec aqueduct was this. 200,000 people woke up on May the 27th, 1521, without access to fresh water. The aqueduct was 12 kilometers of stone channel that brought spring water from the Chapultepec hills to the island city. There was no replacement for it. The lake surrounding Tenochtitlan was brackish, salt water, undrinkable. And within days, as Warfare History Network's account of the final campaign documents, the population was forced to drink it anyway. Drinking salt water in sufficient quantities produces dehydration that accelerates rather than relieves thirst. The biological consequences of this began killing Tenochtitlan's inhabitants before a single sword was drawn on the causeways. Cortez had divided his land forces into 3 divisions, each assigned to one of the 3 great causeways. Pedro de Alvarado commanded the Tlacopan approach on the west. 30 horsemen, 18 crossbowmen and harquebusiers, 150 Spanish foot soldiers, and 25,000 Tlaxcalan warriors. Cristobal de Olid held the Coyoacan position, with comparable Spanish numbers and 20,000 indigenous allies. Gonzalo de Sandoval commanded the 3rd Division. Cortez himself commanded the brigantine fleet, positioning the ships to support all 3 land divisions and to prevent any canoe from reaching the city with supplies. Each Spanish land division had 25 soldiers and their artillerymen stationed aboard brigantines specifically assigned to cover their causeway approach. since each vessel carried one cannon and the causeway fighting had repeatedly demonstrated the necessity of waterside fire support. The Mexica defenders' response on the first days of the formal siege was, by multiple accounts, impressive in its adaptability. Spanish and indigenous accounts both document that the Aztec warriors quickly learned to avoid the direct trajectory of Spanish cannon fire, ducking, scattering, moving erratically to deny the Spanish gunners predictable targets. They used their intimate knowledge of the urban terrain to launch nighttime raids on besieging forces who had no equivalent knowledge of the ground. They drove stakes into the lake bottom to threaten the brigantines. The Florentine Codex, through its description of Mexica resistance preserved in Leon Portilla's work, records a defending force that was not demoralized by the siege's opening. It was adapting. The pattern that emerged in the first weeks became the siege's defining rhythm. Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces advanced along the causeways during daylight, capturing sections of approach and filling the gap bridges that the Aztecs had broken with rubble, converting them into solid ground, impassable by the canoes that had previously allowed attacks from both sides of the causeway simultaneously. At nightfall, the Spanish withdrew to their siege camps. During the night, Mexica warriors moved back into the abandoned positions and reopened the canal breaches, removing the rubble, restoring the water barriers, returning the causeways to their pre-advanced state. This was not Aztec tactical incompetence. It was sound defensive doctrine applied to an asymmetric situation. The Aztecs lacked the strength to destroy the besieging force in open battle. The Spanish lacked the strength to hold every inch of captured ground at night against a population defending its own city. The stalemate was real, and it was grinding. Hall of Ancient Warriors' account of this phase describes it as brutal and repetitive, a phrase that captures the exhaustion accumulating on both sides of the causeway, though the natures of that exhaustion were radically different. The Spanish were tired and in danger. The Mexica were tired, in danger, increasingly thirsty, and watching their city being demolished around them. That last point requires emphasis. Cortez, recognizing that withdrawing each night was costing him everything his soldiers had fought for during the day, made a decision that would shape every week that followed. He ordered the systematic demolition of the city. Every building in the path of the advance, every palace, every temple, every house, was to be torn down. The rubble was used to permanently fill the canal breaches, converting the causeway gaps into solid ground that cavalry could cross and that could not be reopened overnight. This was not tactical improvisation. It was a deliberate choice to destroy one of the most extraordinary cities on Earth in order to advance 50 meters at a time. The question that colonial accounts do not answer directly, and that modern historians can only approach through inference, is what Cortez actually felt about this decision. His letters to Charles V had described the city in terms of wonder. He had wanted to present it intact to his king. The systematic demolition was the death of that ambition. What the Chronicles record is not his internal state, but the orders he gave. And the orders he gave destroyed Tenochtitlan. Somewhere in the second month of the siege, the distinction between attacking and defending became philosophically unclear. The Spanish were advancing into a city they were simultaneously destroying. The Mexica were defending a city that was being demolished around them, fighting from the rubble of their own houses, using as cover the stone of temples that had stood for a century. The Causeway War, in its grinding middle phase, defies the narrative of inevitable conquest that later Spanish accounts would construct. It was not inevitable. It was brutal, repetitive, and genuinely in doubt for weeks at a time. The sacrifice of Spanish prisoners at the Templo Mayor is documented across multiple sources and constitutes one of the siege's most psychologically significant episodes. Wikipedia's account of the Spanish conquest records that, Defenders cut the beating hearts from 70 Spanish prisoners of war at the altar to Huitzilopochtli during the siege, an event witnessed from the causeways by soldiers who could do nothing to intervene. Bernal Diaz's memoir records the psychological devastation this caused. Spanish soldiers watching their captured comrades marched up the pyramid steps, the drum beating, the priests moving with practiced efficiency, the heads thrown down the stairs afterward. This was not Aztec cruelty in any simple sense. It was Aztec religious practice conducted as psychological warfare, and it worked. The drum was audible from the causeways. The sacrifice was visible from the siege lines. The message was deliberate and precise. This is what awaits you. Inside the city, the Florentine Codex records what the siege looked like from Tenochtitlan's interior. And it is among the most harrowing accounts in any language of what urban siege warfare does to a civilian population. The Mexica defenders were starving. The aqueducts were gone. The lake water was making people sick. The tribute system had collapsed before the siege began. Mexico unexplains account of the siege's final weeks, drawing on Aztec sources, documents that by July the population was eating lizards, bark, and leather goods, anything that could be consumed. The streets accumulated the dead. Even Cortez, in one of his letters that is more candid than most, wrote that the streets were so filled with bodies that it was almost impossible to pass through them. Cuauhtémoc's response to these conditions was to fight harder. He led sorties personally, as documented in Aztec accounts. He executed deserters to maintain military discipline, confirmed in the Mexico Unexplained account. He organized nighttime raids on besieging forces that extracted a consistent toll. The Mexico warriors' use of the urban terrain, the narrow streets, the canal intersections, the rooftops, neutralized Spanish cavalry and reduced the effectiveness of Spanish crossbows and arquebuses by denying the sight lines those weapons required. Cortez's attempt to build a catapult to accelerate the reduction of the last Aztec-held sectors, documented by Bernal Diaz del Castillo, failed. The machine didn't function properly, as Diaz records with the blunt honesty that characterizes his memoir at its best. The Tlaxcalan allies' behavior during this phase deserves direct acknowledgement, because it appears in the historical record and cannot be omitted. Wikipedia's account of the siege notes that Cortez's indigenous allies, particularly the Tlaxcalans, conducted themselves with a ferocity that even Spanish officers struggled to contain, slaughtering civilians in captured sectors in acts of revenge that, as Wikipedia observes, suggests that Cortez's Indian allies had more power over him than he suggested. This was not Spanish military policy in the formal sense. It was what happened when people who had been subjugated by the Mexica for generations finally had the opportunity to answer the injury. The historical record documents it without resolving its moral complexity, and neither should this account. By the end of June, the Spanish had not captured a single permanent block of the city. They had captured rubble, which was all that remained of the blocks they had demolished. And then, on June the 29th, 1521, something happened that most histories of the conquest move past quickly. The Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces suffered a severe defeat on the causeway on June the 29th, 1521. This is documented in Wikipedia's timeline of the Spanish conquest. Defeat of Spanish Tlaxcalteca forces on a causeway. Capture and ritual sacrifice of the Spaniards and their horses in Tenochtitlan. Cortez himself was at serious personal risk during this engagement, according to multiple accounts of the day. Spanish soldiers were captured. Those captured soldiers were sacrificed at the Templo Mayor in full view of the siege lines, including at least one horse, which had a psychological significance beyond the military loss, since the horse had functioned throughout the campaign as a symbol of Spanish power that the Aztecs could not match. Nahua-aligned accounts, including the detailed reconstruction offered by David Bowles drawing on indigenous sources, describe this as a moment when the siege's outcome was genuinely in question. When the damage to the Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces was severe enough that the possibility of Cuauhtémoc pressing the advantage existed in a real, rather than theoretical sense. Whether this constitutes a full expulsion comparable to La Noche Triste, as some indigenous accounts suggest, or a severe causeway defeat followed by Spanish regrouping, as the Wikipedia framing implies, is itself a question of sources and perspective. What is not in question is that the Spanish force was significantly damaged, and that the initiative, briefly, lay with the Aztec defenders. Aztec accounts, as reflected in Bowles's reconstruction, suggest that Cuauhtémoc did not pursue. The chronicles hint at this, without providing a clean explanation. The historical record offers context rather than certainty. His forces were starving and had been fighting for more than 6 weeks. The brigantines controlled the lake, which meant any pursuit off the causeways would have faced cannon fire from the water. The Spanish cavalry, devastating in open ground, could not be engaged on advantageous Aztec terms outside the urban terrain. The pursuit that might have destroyed Cortez's army would have required the Mexica to fight in the conditions that favored the Spanish rather than themselves. These are reasonable military explanations. They may be the complete explanation, but indigenous accounts preserve something more ambiguous, a sense that the decision was made under conditions of exhaustion and disease that compromised it in ways no military logic fully accounts for. The Florentine Codex's account of the siege does not reconstruct Cuauhtémoc's decision-making in this moment. The historical gap exists, and honest history acknowledges it rather than filling it with interpretation presented as fact. What followed the June 29th reversal was Cortez's escalation. He received fresh reinforcements and supplies via ships arriving at Veracruz. He intensified the demolition policy. He launched the final offer of surrender to Cuauhtémoc, which was rejected immediately and without negotiation. Warfare History Network's account of the final campaign phase describes the Spanish in August as controlling most of the city. The Aztec defenders compressed into the northern district of Tlatelolco, their numbers now perhaps 40,000 warriors and civilians, a fraction of the population that had begun the siege. The drum kept beating from the Templo Mayor, audible to everyone on both sides. Cortez launched the final assault on August the 12th, 1521. He had been trying to end this for 80 days. He would end it the next morning. By July of 1521, Tenochtitlan no longer looked like Tenochtitlan. The temples were rubble used to fill canals. The canals themselves had become streets. The streets were full of bodies. The Florentine Codex records that survivors of the final weeks were found lying in their own filth, too weak to stand, the dead piling in rooms and courtyards and along the edges of former canals. Cortez, in a letter that is more candid than most of his correspondence to Charles V, wrote that the city was so full of bodies that it was almost impossible to pass through the streets. Even accounting for the rhetorical purposes of his letters, the description aligns with what the Aztec accounts record independently. The remaining defenders, compressed into the northern district of Tlatelolco, the last sector of the island that the Spanish and their allies had not yet demolished, were fighting with everything that remained of an empire. Women fought alongside men with slings and clubs, documented in Wikipedia's account of Cuauhtémoc's final weeks of resistance. Warriors who had not eaten adequately in weeks continued to launch nighttime raids against the besieging forces. The Huehuetl war drum beat from the Templo Mayor, the sound that Spanish accounts describe as audible throughout the siege from miles away, the sound that accompanied every sacrifice, every ritual. Every moment of Aztec defiance continued through July and into August. The sacred precinct itself fell to the coalition forces during July. This space, which could accommodate approximately 8,000 people for the great religious festivals, became a killing ground as the Spanish advance pushed through it. The Templo Mayor's twin pyramids, which had dominated the ceremonial core of the city for a century, were captured and eventually demolished. The silence when the drums stopped was, by multiple accounts, the strangest thing anyone in the valley had heard in months. Cuauhtémoc's position in these final weeks is preserved in both Spanish and indigenous accounts in ways that illuminate his character without sentimentalizing it. Mexico unexplains account of the siege's final phase, drawing on Aztec sources, records that he executed deserters to the end. He continued to organize sorties, even as the available ground shrank to the point where there was almost nowhere left to sortie from. He rejected every diplomatic approach Cortez made during this period. Though Cortez attempted multiple overtures, as documented in Wikipedia's account of the siege, driven, scholars note, by his continuing desire to preserve something of the city's physical form for presentation to the king. Cuauhtémoc's rejection of those overtures was consistent and unambiguous. Hall of Ancient Warriors' account of the siege estimates that by early August, the remaining Aztec-controlled area, the last pocket of Tlatelolco, held approximately 40,000 to 50,000 warriors and civilians. Many of those civilians were not fighters. Children, old people too weak to flee, even if there had been somewhere to flee to. The Aztec fighters defending this space were doing so for those people as much as for any military objective. On August the 12th, Cortez gave the order for the final assault. The Florentine Codex preserves a sentence from an Aztec account of these last hours that Warfare History Network includes in its narrative of the siege. We jostled and crowded against one another, but no one could go anywhere. By August the 13th, the organized resistance had collapsed. Hundreds of canoes pushed off from the island's last edges, carrying whoever could reach them: warriors, nobles, women, children, into a lake that belonged to Cortez's brigantines. The Aztec Empire ended not in a final climactic battle, but in a canoe interception on a lake. Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape from the last Aztec-held sector of Tlatelolco on August the 13th, 1521, with his wife Isabel Moctezuma, his family, his closest advisors, and what remained of the imperial treasury. Gold, jewels, the portable wealth of a collapsing civilization. Cortez had anticipated exactly this. He had sent the brigantines out specifically to intercept the canoes fleeing the dying city. The vessel, commanded by Gonzalo de Sandoval, identified Cuauhtémoc's canoe and pulled alongside it. The surrender scene that followed is preserved in both Spanish and Nahua accounts, which differ in emphasis but not in their essential facts. According to Wikipedia's account of Cuauhtémoc, drawing on Spanish sources, he asked Cortez to take his dagger and kill him. Cortez refused. He said, in the version that Spanish chronicles preserve, "You have defended your capital like a brave warrior. A Spaniard knows how to respect valor, even in an enemy." David Bowles's reconstruction, drawing on Nahua-aligned sources, gives Cuauhtémoc's reported words differently. "I surrender, on the condition that my people be allowed to leave the island to search for food, and that my wife be left unharmed." These accounts are not incompatible. They record different moments or different emphases within the same moment, filtered through different purposes. The praise of Cuauhtémoc in the Spanish version served Cortez's interests in presenting himself as magnanimous. The conditional surrender in the Nahua version served the purpose of recording that Cuauhtémoc negotiated for his people even in the moment of defeat. At Cuauhtémoc's request, Cortez permitted the surviving population of Tenochtitlan to depart unmolested. over the following 3 days, the survivors marched out of the ruins, what remained of the most populous city in the Americas. New World Encyclopedia notes that almost all of the nobility were dead, and the remaining survivors were mostly very young children. The streets they marched through were the rubble of their city. The canals they crossed on bridges were filled with stone from the temples that had stood above them. The Tlaxcalan allies and other indigenous forces in the coalition did not observe the terms Cortez had offered. Wikipedia's account of the siege records a merciless campaign of slaughter and looting in the days following the surrender that Spanish officers were unable or unwilling to stop. Acts of revenge for generations of tribute, captive-taking, and enforced subordination. This is documented across multiple sources. It complicates the narrative of orderly conquest that Cortez's letters construct. And historians who have examined the evidence, including Wikipedia's editors drawing on the Bernal Diaz account, note that the indigenous allies' conduct suggests they had more power over him than he suggested. The coalition that Cortez had assembled and managed with such skill for 2 years executed its own settling of accounts on August the 13th and the days that followed. As many as 40,000 Aztec bodies were floating in the canals or awaiting burial after the siege's end, according to Wikipedia's account of the fall of Tenochtitlan. This is a figure from Spanish-aligned sources and should be understood as an estimate rather than a count. It is consistent with what multiple accounts describe as the physical condition of the city in the siege's final weeks. The drum was silent. The causeways were rubble. The city that Bernal Diaz had compared to the enchantments of a romance novel was gone. Cortez's magnanimity lasted approximately as long as it took his men to ask where the gold was. The question was not trivial. A substantial portion of the wealth that the Spanish had accumulated during their original occupation of Tenochtitlan, and that Moctezuma had provided to Cortez as diplomatic gifts, had been lost during La Noche Triste, when soldiers drowned in Lake Texcoco under the weight of gold they refused to abandon. Cortez had promised Charles V a portion of this wealth. He had promised his soldiers their share. He had promised the alliance partners various forms of material reward. The gold that should have validated all of these promises was not in evidence. Wikipedia's account of the siege records what happened next with the directness it deserves. Cortez ordered Cuauhtémoc and the Lord of Tlacopan, Tetlapanquetzal, to have their feet oiled and burned over coals. The purpose was to force the revelation of where the hidden Aztec treasure was located. Cuauhtémoc's response under this torture became legendary in both Spanish and indigenous accounts. New World Encyclopedia's summary of what the gold inquiry produced. For the Aztecs, gold had no intrinsic value in the European sense. They did not produce the large, solid pieces of refined metal that the Spanish expected, but worked ornamental objects that, when melted down, yielded a fraction of the wealth that Cortez and his men had anticipated. The Aztec treasury, to Spanish eyes, had already largely been melted down, sent to Spain, or thrown into the lake. What remained was not what the conquest had been imagined to produce. Cuauhtémoc lived for 4 more years after the siege, retained by Cortez as a nominal puppet ruler because Cortez feared leaving him behind as a potential rebellion leader. In 1525, Cortez took Cuauhtémoc on his Honduras expedition. A disastrous 2-year journey through jungle that damaged Cortez's health and his political position simultaneously. On February the 28th, 1525, Cortez had Cuauhtémoc tried for alleged treason and hanged. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was present and who had served Cortez throughout the conquest, wrote in his memoir that he believed Cuauhtémoc innocent. The execution was, in Diaz's assessment, unjust. Cuauhtémoc's last words, preserved in New World Encyclopedia's account and attributed to colonial chronicles, were addressed to Cortez. I knew what it was, to trust to your false promises. I knew that you had destined me to this fate since I did not fall by my own hand when you entered my city of Tenochtitlan. These words should be understood as passing through multiple layers of transmission: indigenous oral account, colonial recording, subsequent translation, and presented as reported rather than verbatim. Their substance is consistent with everything the historical record shows about Cuauhtémoc's clarity regarding Spanish intentions. The Tlaxcalan story followed a different and slower trajectory toward the same destination. The formal recognition as conquistadors, the tax exemptions, the right to carry Spanish weapons, all of it began eroding within a generation. By the 1580s, Wikipedia documents, Tlaxcalan nobles were sending formal embassies to Spain to plead for the restoration of promises that Cortés had made and that the colonial bureaucracy had quietly set aside. The men who provided the bulk of the military force that took Tenochtitlan, whose 30,000 dead warfare history network documents, had exchanged Aztec dominance for Spanish dominance, and the second proved more durable than the first. Cortés himself died on December 2nd, 1547, in a legal dispute with his own government. His remains moved 8 times in the centuries since, the city he founded having declined to build him a monument. Cortés built Mexico City directly on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Not beside the ruins, not near them, on top of them. The decision was symbolic and administrative simultaneously. The new capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain would occupy the same geographic position as its predecessor, assert dominance over the same landscape, and draw on the same logistical infrastructure while replacing every visible element of its meaning. The stones of the Templo Mayor were used to build the Metropolitan Cathedral. The site of Moctezuma II's 300-room palace became the National Palace. The Wikipedia account of Tenochtitlan's colonial transformation describes this as hybrid urbanism, a spatial overwriting of Aztec sacred geography using Aztec building materials. The name chosen for the new capital honored this layering in a way that Spanish officials may not have fully appreciated. Mexico City, a name derived from Mexica, the Nahuatl name for the people the Spanish had just defeated. The conquerors named their capital after the conquered. This anomaly persists to the present day. The ecological consequences of building a European-style city in a lake basin were not immediately apparent and took centuries to fully materialize. The Aztec hydraulic engineering that had managed Lake Texcoco for generations, the dike of Netzahualcoyotl, the aqueducts, the canal system, the regulated relationship between fresh and brackish water, was dismantled or allowed to decay as the Spanish imposed a different urban logic on the same geography. The result, pursued over subsequent centuries, was the progressive drainage of Lake Texcoco. The lake that had defined Tenochtitlan, that had made the city simultaneously defensible and magnificent, was eventually drained entirely. Modern Mexico City, built on the former lake bed, subsides at approximately 10 centimeters per year in some areas due to aquifer depletion, a direct consequence of the Aztec engineering being replaced by systems that could not manage what the Aztecs had managed. Charles V named Cortés Captain General of New Spain and eventually granted him the title Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca. He was not given the governorship. The Council of the Indies, constituted in 1524, began the process of imposing royal bureaucratic authority over a territory that Cortés had won through personal initiative and that the crown was not prepared to leave in personal hands. The first audiencia replaced direct Cortés governance by 1527. Cortés spent the following 2 decades returning to Spain, arguing his case, winning titles and estates, and losing the political authority he believed the conquest had earned him. The surviving Aztec population was incorporated into the encomienda system. Formal Spanish rights over indigenous labor that constituted, in practice, institutionalized servitude. The Aztec nobility had been almost entirely destroyed during the siege. New World Encyclopedia notes that the remaining survivors were mostly very young children. The social infrastructure that had governed Tenochtitlan and the surrounding region for a century was gone. What replaced it was a colonial system that would persist in various forms for 300 years. Two physical traces of Tenochtitlan survived the colonial overwriting into the modern era. In 1978, electrical workers in Mexico City discovered the Coyoxauqui stone, a massive carved disc depicting the dismembered moon goddess, beneath the pavement of the city's historic center. The discovery triggered excavations of the Templo Mayor that continue to the present day. The stones that built the cathedral are also, in this sense, still the Templo Mayor. The city that Cortez demolished is still there, 20 feet below the streets. Every number that follows is an estimate. This is not a caveat offered for legal protection. It is a description of what the historical record actually contains. The only people positioned to count the Aztec dead during and after the siege were people with significant interests in how those numbers were reported. The indigenous administrative infrastructure that might have maintained population records had been destroyed by the epidemic before the siege began. No independent archaeological census exists. What survives is a range of figures from interested sources, and honest history presents them as such. Wikipedia's account of the fall of Tenochtitlan gives the broadest and most commonly cited range: between 100,000 and 240,000 Aztec dead overall, including warriors and civilians. New World Encyclopedia gives the higher figure, 240,000, as the estimate attributed to Aztec historians writing after the conquest. Wikipedia additionally documents that as many as 40,000 Aztec bodies were floating in the canals or awaiting burial in the immediate aftermath of the siege. These figures come primarily from Spanish-aligned sources and post-conquest Aztec accounts that were themselves compiled under colonial conditions. They are consistent with the physical descriptions of the city that multiple witnesses provide independently. They are not precise. Spanish casualties during the siege itself were remarkably low, and this disproportion is itself historically significant. Wikipedia notes that although some reports put the number as low as 40, the Spanish probably lost over 100 soldiers during the 80-day siege. Total Spanish dead across the entire 2-year campaign from Veracruz to Tenochtitlan, including La Noche Triste, the Battle of Otumba, and all intermediate engagements, amounted to approximately 1,800, according to historian Hugh Thomas's Conquest, cited in Wikipedia's account. The disproportion between this figure and the Aztec casualty range, roughly 100 to 1 at the extreme estimates, is the most dramatic number in the siege's accounting. It reflects the brigantines' one-sided dominance on the water, the canyon-like channeling of combat onto the causeways where Spanish steel and Tlaxcalan numbers applied lethal pressure, and the invisible toll that famine and epidemic took on the defenders independent of combat. The indigenous Allied casualties are the least discussed and the most important to acknowledge. Warfare History Network estimates that the Tlaxcalans alone lost 30,000 fighters over the course of the entire campaign. Wikipedia confirms that thousands of Tlaxcalans perished in the siege specifically. These are the people who provided the decisive military mass, the infantry, the porters, the canal crews, and their losses are frequently omitted from the accounting that follows Spanish casualty figures through the historical literature. What the numbers cannot tell us is worth stating explicitly. The separation of epidemic deaths from combat deaths during the siege period is impossible. People were dying of smallpox, famine, dehydration from saltwater consumption, and Tlaxcalan swords simultaneously. The civilian population of Tenochtitlan was not an army, and its losses were not military losses in any conventional accounting. The demographic catastrophe that the conquest initiated, the collapse of the indigenous population of central Mexico from an estimated 16 to 30 million, before contact to 1.5 to 3 million by 1568. A figure cited across multiple sources, is a consequence of the siege and the colonial period that followed it, not separable from either. Behind every number in this accounting, families that received no notification, bodies that had no burial ceremony, names that appear in no chronicle. The siege lasted 80 days. The dying went on for generations. 7 years after the siege ended, in 1528, an anonymous Nahua scribe wrote something that historians have been reading ever since. Not a battle report, not a diplomatic account, a poem. The Duke University Press Review of Miguel Leon Portilla's compilation, The Broken Spears, the Aztec account of the conquest of Mexico. Published in 1959, and the first time indigenous accounts of the conquest were presented to broad audiences in connected form. Quotes the lament as Leon Portilla translated it. Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. This is the oldest surviving indigenous prose account of the conquest, written in Nahuatl using the Spanish alphabet approximately 5 years after the siege, by informants from Tlatelolco who were likely participants or witnesses. Leon Portilla called them the anonymous informants of Tlatelolco. Their account preserves what official Spanish documents were not designed to record: the sound of drums, the smell of the city, the specific texture of fear and hunger and grief that the siege imposed on the people defending it. The difference between their account and Cortez's letters to Charles V is not simply one of perspective. It is a difference between a legal argument and a testimony. The Florentine Codex is the other essential indigenous primary source, and understanding what it is requires understanding how it was produced. Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún began the research that would become the Florentine Codex in approximately 1545, working in systematic collaboration with Nahua elders and authors who had been his students at the Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco. The resulting work, 12 books, 2,500 pages, nearly 2,000 illustrations by Nahua artists, was completed in its final form in 1577. Book 12 covers the conquest specifically, from the Tenochtitlan Tlatelolco perspective, and is described by World History Encyclopedia as one of the most remarkable accounts of a non-Western culture ever composed. The Florentine Codex was completed in parallel columns of Nahuatl and Spanish, and as scholars studying both texts have noted, the two columns are not translations of each other. They sometimes diverge significantly, the Spanish frequently abbreviating or reinterpreting the Nahuatl, which is why modern scholarship insists on reading both. What the indigenous accounts emphasize that Spanish sources minimize or omit reveals the difference in what each set of sources was designed to accomplish. The Tlaxcalan massacre, Pedro de Alvarado's attack on unarmed festival celebrants in May of 1520, occupies the very first page of the Florentine Codex's Book 12. The Nahua authors placed it there deliberately. They were making an argument about causation. The war that destroyed Tenochtitlan was unjust, and its injustice began with that massacre. The epidemic receives extended, visceral description in the indigenous accounts. Cortez's letters barely mention it, because mentioning it would have reduced the military achievement the letters were designed to document. The survival of these accounts is itself a story worth telling. The Spanish authorities eventually suppressed the Florentine Codex, ordering Sahagún to hand over all his materials in 1575. The completed manuscript was sent to Europe, where it entered the Medici family's library in Florence, which is why it is called the Florentine Codex and not the Tenochtitlan Codex. In 2012, high-resolution digital scans of all volumes were added to the World Digital Library. The words that the Spanish tried to bury in a Florentine archive are now accessible to anyone with an internet connection, in Nahuatl and Spanish simultaneously, with the Nahua artists' illustrations intact. The conquered did not only lose, they also wrote, and some of what they wrote survived. The version of the conquest that most people encounter goes roughly like this. A few hundred Spanish soldiers, with steel armor and horses and gunpowder weapons, defeated an empire of millions through technological superiority. This version has been the dominant popular narrative for centuries. It is also, in the assessment of modern conquest scholarship, substantially wrong on almost every significant point. Matthew Restall's 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, published in 2003 by Oxford University Press and now a standard text in university history courses, identifies the small band of conquistadors narrative as among the most persistent myths about this period of history. The conquest of Tenochtitlan was not achieved by 900 Spanish soldiers. It was achieved by a coalition of potentially 150,000 indigenous warriors, led by Spanish officers who provided military technology, diplomatic intelligence, and, crucially, a shared enemy, around which competing indigenous grievances could be organized. Eric Wolf's formulation, cited earlier and worth repeating, is the cleaner version. Spanish firepower and cavalry would have been impotent without the support of the indigenous coalition. This is the modern scholarly consensus, and it fundamentally reframes who won the siege of Tenochtitlan and why. The role of smallpox remains genuinely contested, which is worth distinguishing from the indigenous coalition question where the consensus is clearer. Alfred Crosby's argument, developed in the Columbian Exchange and subsequent works, places epidemic disease at the center of European colonial success across the Americas. Not just in Mexico, but in Peru, North America, and the Caribbean simultaneously. Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel popularized a version of this argument that emphasizes biological factors over political and military ones. Restall's counter is methodological rather than empirical. Overdetermining disease removes agency from the indigenous actors whose decisions to ally with Cortez, to fight against him, to negotiate for their own political advantage, were the actual mechanisms of the conquest. Both positions have scholarly support. The debate is not resolved. The Quetzalcoatl myth deserves explicit treatment because it continues to appear in popular histories despite having been thoroughly debunked by academic scholarship. The claim that Aztecs believed Cortez was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, and that this belief caused Moctezuma's apparent passivity in the face of the Spanish advance, was identified by Restall and historian Camilla Townsend as a post-conquest invention, probably created by indigenous people seeking to explain Moctezuma's behavior in retrospective terms that made sense within their cosmological framework, and adopted by Spanish sources because it cast the conquest as divinely ordained. The modern scholarly consensus, as Wikipedia's account of the Spanish conquest notes, is that the Aztecs, especially the inner circle around Moctezuma, did not believe that Cortez was a god in any shape or form. Using this myth in any serious historical account of the conquest is not a matter of taking a contested position. It is a matter of repeating something that the scholarly literature has firmly rejected. What all these debates share is their dependence on a source problem that has no clean resolution. Every Spanish source was written by someone with legal and financial interests in the conquest's outcome. Every indigenous source was compiled after the conquest under colonial conditions by people navigating a new power structure. No neutral contemporary account exists. The historian's task is not to find the objective record, but to understand what each source was designed to accomplish and to read the gap between them. The gap, in this case, is large enough to contain an empire. Military historians studying Tenochtitlan tend to focus on the brigantines, the steel, the gunpowder. These are the elements that fit the conventional narrative of technological superiority determining historical outcomes. They are also, in the judgment of modern conquest scholarship, the wrong elements to center. The decisive innovation of the Tenochtitlan campaign was diplomatic. Cortez built and maintained a coalition of between 80,000 and 150,000 indigenous warriors drawn from populations with competing interests, old grievances against each other as well as against Tenochtitlan, and every rational reason to distrust a foreign commander operating in defiance of his own government. He held this coalition together through 2 years of military campaigning. Significant setbacks including La Noche Triste, internal tensions documented in Wikipedia's account of the conquest, and the constant pressure of Aztec diplomatic counter-efforts to break his alliances. This is not a military achievement in the conventional sense. It is a political achievement of the highest order, and it was the prerequisite for everything else. The siege doctrine that Cortez employed, systematic isolation of a supply-dependent urban center through the sequential destruction of its logistical infrastructure, is a principle that appears in military theory across centuries and cultures. He did not attack Tenochtitlan directly. He removed everything the city needed to sustain itself. Fresh water first, via the Chapultepec aqueduct, then resupply by lake, via the brigantines, then the city's hinterland food sources, via the months of campaign preceding the formal siege. By the time the 80-day siege began, Tenochtitlan was already dying. The military operations on the causeways were the application of final pressure to a system already in collapse. Cuauhtémoc's tactical responses deserve recognition as genuinely sophisticated rather than as futile gestures. His urban combat strategy, drawing the Spanish into narrow streets where cavalry and arquebuses lost their effectiveness, was sound doctrine that worked until the city itself was demolished from underneath it. His countermeasures against the brigantines, underwater stakes, lake-bottom pits, demonstrated creative adaptation to a new threat under conditions of extreme constraint. He was defeated not by military incompetence, but by factors that compounded before the siege's formal beginning. Epidemic disease that eliminated his leadership cadre and compromised his military capacity. A coalition of former subject peoples larger than his remaining army, and the systematic removal of everything a besieged city needs to sustain resistance. This is worth stating because it is true, and because it corrects a persistent implication in Spanish triumphalist accounts that the Aztec defenders were somehow inadequate to their own defense. They were not. They were destroyed. The counterfactual exercise is speculative by definition, but not without value. If Cuitlahuac had survived the smallpox epidemic, the emperor who had actually expelled the Spanish ones, the political and military situation facing Cortez in 1521 would have been significantly different. If the Tlaxcalan Council had made a different decision in September of 1519, declining the alliance rather than embracing it, Cortez would have faced the entire subsequent campaign without his essential partner. If the brigantines had failed during the mountain portage, a possibility that the logistical complexity of the operation made genuinely real, Cortez had no alternative plan for lake control. Any one of these changes alters the story. All three simultaneously would have ended it. The siege of Tenochtitlan was not won by Spanish steel. It was won by Tlaxcalan fury, political intelligence of a very high order, 13 ships carried over a mountain, and a virus that didn't know whose side it was on. Stand in the Zocalo, Mexico City's central plaza, and you are standing on top of Tenochtitlan. The Metropolitan Cathedral is on your right, built from the stones of the Templo Mayor. The National Palace is on your left, on the site of Moctezuma II's 300-room compound. 20 feet below the cathedral floor, excavations begun in 1978 are still ongoing. The Templo Mayor was not demolished. It was buried and is being uncovered. The discovery that triggered those excavations was accidental. Electrical workers found the Coyoxauqui stone, a massive carved disc depicting the dismembered moon goddess, in February of 1978, while digging beneath a street in the historic center. The Mexican government established the Museo del Templo Mayor on the site, and excavations have continued for nearly 50 years since. Every few years, new artifacts emerge from beneath the streets of the capital, offering fragments of what the city was before August of 1521, and complicating the clean overwriting that the colonial period attempted. Cuauhtémoc's presence in modern Mexico is everywhere and entirely one-sided. A monument to him stands on the Paseo de la Reforma, the same boulevard that houses monuments to Mexico's national heroes. His face has appeared on Mexican coins and banknotes. The Mexican Navy's training vessel is named the Cuauhtémoc, and it serves as a cultural ambassador, visiting ports around the world. Wikipedia's account of his legacy notes that he is the embodiment of indigenous nationalism in Mexico, the only Aztec emperor who survived the conquest by the Spanish Empire, and the one who fought hardest against it. Cortez, by contrast, has no major public monument in Mexico City. The man who founded the city is effectively absent from the city's civic memory, except as a presence implied by what the monuments to Cuauhtémoc are responding to. In 2021, 500 years after the fall, Mexico and Spain marked the quincentennial in ways that illustrated how unsettled this history remains. The Mexican government under President López Obrador demanded a formal apology from Spain for the conquest. Spain declined. The state government of Tlaxcala, whose ancestors provided the fighting force that actually took Tenochtitlan, issued its own statement rejecting the characterization of their ancestors as traitors and asserting, correctly in the judgment of modern historians, that the Tlaxcalans made a rational decision to destroy their hereditary enemies. The Tlaxcalan statement was politically directed at the Mexico City government's framing of the conquest as purely Spanish aggression against the Mexica, a framing that, as Restall and other scholars have demonstrated, obscures the indigenous politics that made the conquest possible. The lake is gone. Lake Texcoco has been progressively drained since the colonial period, as the Spanish-derived city struggled to manage flooding that the Aztec engineering had controlled through the dike system they dismantled. The aquifer that underlies what was once the lake bed is depleted by Mexico City's enormous population, causing the city to sink, in some areas, at approximately 10 centimeters per year. The engineering marvel that sustained Tenochtitlan has been replaced by a system that cannot sustain what replaced it. The fall of Tenochtitlan is not settled history in Mexico. It is a political argument that is happening right now in monuments and museum exhibitions and government statements about who owns the story of a civilization's ending and what that ending means for the country built on its ruins. 500 years is a long time. It has not been long enough. The drums stopped on August the 13th, 1521. The Huehuetl war drum of the Templo Mayor. the sound that Spanish accounts describe as audible throughout the 80-day siege from miles away, beating through the smoke and the smell and the dying, fell silent when the last Aztec defenders abandoned the pyramid steps. Multiple accounts record it as the strangest silence anyone in the Valley of Mexico had heard in months. What the siege cost cannot be stated with precision because the historical record does not permit precision. Between 100,000 and 240,000 Aztec dead. That range is a historian's acknowledgement that the exact number is beyond recovery. 30,000 Tlaxcalan warriors dead, according to Warfare History Network's account. Men who fought for their own liberation and received promises that lasted 2 generations. Over 100 Spanish soldiers dead in the siege itself. Approximately 1,800 Spanish dead across the entire campaign. And Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, who lived 4 more years before Cortez had him hanged on a jungle road in Honduras in 1525. For a treason that Bernal Diaz believed he never committed. The Nahua scribe who wrote in 1528 did not write a military analysis or a diplomatic account. He wrote, "Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood." 7 years after the siege. Still present tense. What the fall created was New Spain, 300 years of colonial rule, then independence, then a country still arguing about whether the Tlaxcalans were traitors or liberators, still sinking into the drained bed of the lake that once held the city, still building on top of what it replaced. The Templo Mayor is 20 feet below the cathedral. The cathedral is built from the Templo Mayor's stones. Modern Mexico City is built on the former lake bed. These are not metaphors. They are the literal physical situation of a capital city that has never fully resolved its own founding. The siege of Tenochtitlan was not won by 900 Spanish soldiers. It was won by a coalition of potentially 150,000 indigenous warriors who wanted the empire gone. A virus that didn't choose sides, 13 ships carried piece by piece over a mountain range, and an enslaved woman named Malintzin, who stood on captured palace rooftops and translated a civilization's ending into words that both sides could understand. The Templo Mayor is still there, 20 feet below you. The excavations are ongoing. Every few years, something emerges from beneath the streets of the capital that the Spanish thought they had buried completely. They never entirely managed it.